On our flight to our destination, we had to wake up the rest of those that were in stasis. I'll tell you what, stasis may suck on one end when you have to be slapped awake because you're being boarded by space pirates. It sucks just as much when you have to wake people up and let them know that everyone they loved, everyone they cared about, and even their entire planet is gone. Many cried, others went catatonic for a while, others simply turned and you could see rage in their eyes. And a few, of course, had that simple, okay, I got nothing left to lose look on their faces. Me? I was told I was looking 1,000 yards off in the distance for a while, but whatever. We have work to do. As everyone got defrosted, I guess you could say, we were all given things to do. It didn't matter if that meant for those of us that knew butchery to cut up our former assaulters and serve them up on plates, or if it was just to clean up the bodies, or learning what we needed to do on this ship. Learning the functionality of the ship was actually quite simple. The technology that they use is amazing, and it turns out that you can actually plug yourself into the system. It's a simple device that's implanted just below the base of the skull, or in some cases just on the base of the skull, depending on the person. And there you are. You can plug right into the ship and start downloading a whole bunch of stuff. Yeah, I know this seemed science fiction back in the day, but welcome to science fact. And the fact of the matter is, we need to learn as much as possible. It was very common to see several of us lined up, seeming like we're sleeping, when in actuality we're downloading and analyzing all sorts of different techniques, different types of statuses, different types of technologies, and we're trying to figure out how everything works. Within a week, we were able to figure out almost the entirety of the ship. Within 2 weeks, any of us could disassemble this thing and reassemble it by hand. Those that had taken us out of the pods were simply amazed at how fast we had absorbed the information. We simply had to remind them that we got nothing else to do but learn. It's either learn or be really bored. Your choice. They did look at us weird when we used a couple turn of phrases, so to speak. Our human slang was completely lost on a lot of them. However, some of the accents were completely lost on the translator. Anything from deep Bostonian all the way to down Louisiana way was always a difficult one to understand. There was, of course, those who actually had an English accent, and yeah, that made it all more fun. It turned out that each of their translators was going haywire every few days trying to figure out what in the hell they were saying. Slang, of course, doesn't translate. So a lot of times when people got mad, they suddenly heard us screaming how we want to mate each other and how we're bred from dogs, or at least born from them, or things like that. But sometimes it was only in jest and they couldn't figure out the way we were, although we did figure out the way they were. Our alien compadres here, most of which come from a strange planet which honestly is very colorful, which explains why their skin looks the way they do, either purple, blue, or red, sometimes even yellow. There was over 1,000 of them on this ship, but now they're down to about 300 or 400. It sucks, but most of them were going to be taken as prisoners. They're not good fighters, though they make excellent engineers. It was at this point we realized it wasn't just them. We had another group that were somewhat feline in the way they looked. It was odd. If I heard another person say consume one more time, I was going to lose my frickin' mind. Because yes, they did have fluffy tails. Yes, they had the ears, but the ears were down where ours were. And yes, they did have whiskers, which honestly turned me off really quick. But the fact of the matter is their whiskers were way back towards the jawline. So, yeah, I guess you could say they were cute. Although most of them were male, so yeah, that took the cuteness out pretty fast. All in all, it was a very interesting crew, and that's only 2 of the different species. We had one that was purely reptilian. I mean, seriously, you'd think this thing was drawn straight out of a comic book, out of like, or off one of those really bad sci-fi shows back in the day. The one, yeah, the Trekkie Trek show. It was pretty close to that god-awful suit. Although this one was a little bit sleeker and a little bit more humanoid. At least that's the way their species was. At least the males were scaly, but the females were very, very sleek, which gave them kind of an elegance as they walked. Yeah, caught a few of my buddies staring. All in all, it was a very interesting group that they had. Many of these were not fighters, of course, but they were definitely good at what they did. And when I say fighters, I mean hand-to-hand fighters, simply because every time they tried to test their strength against ours, we either broke one of their bones, dislocated their joints, or really screwed up their tendons. And we weren't trying to. They were trying to teach us new fighting styles, but it seemed as our typical things of jiu-jitsu, boxing, even some taekwondo was more than enough to take down most of these Xenos. So we had to focus on something else. Focusing on getting ourselves ready. Because what was coming was going to be a fight. The fight was over the space station Zenaka 5. At least that's as close as the translator got to what it was actually pronounced. But we didn't care. At least, we didn't care until we found out the 5 was actually supposed to be a 9. So, whatever. It was what it was. The translator was still trying to figure everything out. But here we were, not only learning about the ships, but learning about the weapons that might be used against us. We were able to find a few from these piglets that we beat the crap out of. Turns out that their energy weapons are mainly for stunning. They're not really as lethal as you would think. Catch one to the eye, yeah, it's going to do some damage. But the fact of the matter is, you look at the medical technology, and a few of the folks, we were able to basically put their limbs back. Those that had actually gone into stasis missing limbs were no longer missing limbs. It was amazing stuff, watching the bodies being rebuilt as they were, as we all trained with each other, but we also fought like we were going to fight. Like we were going to fight to the death, and that led a lot of us breaking bones. My bone density has always been kind of high, but let's face it, your joints are still joints. They still pop, they still crack, they still go out. But they did something to me where it seemed like I was my 21-year-old self or something like that. I even looked myself in the mirror and I looked younger, and I was amazed at this medical tech. Some sort of quantum something or other. I don't get it. It was originally an energy source. I remember hearing something about that. Our folks were looking into it, but they couldn't figure it out. Either that or they didn't want to tell anybody. Regardless, it's here and we're using it. I will say that several of the ladies that were able to be brought out of their pods were more than willing to bring themselves back to a more youthful appearance. Definitely so. Unless they were already youthful. In that case, they just kind of used it to stay that way. Well, let's just say that made things more pleasant to look at. And as it turned out, the clothes we had was about the limit of the clothes we were going to have. It turned out that most of the species didn't wear any, or wore very little. Wearing something about the length of a cocktail dress was about the limit on clothing, which was going to make things a whole lot simpler. You see, we were going to attack a space station, and this space station was huge. It was one of the hubs of commerce that was around there. And because it was such an important hub for commerce, there was no weapons. No large-scale weapons, at least. They had a couple pieces there for some folks of debris or someone trying to run away without paying their dock fees. But to a ship as big we were on? Nah, it ain't gonna do shit. And we wanted to keep it that way. They weren't expecting us. We didn't have an invitation. Hell, we didn't even have permission to dock. So when we got there, things were going to get very hectic very quickly. but we very soon figured out what we could do to handle the situation with their perimeter guns. As we came out of their version of FTL, faster than light travel, a bunch of us got towards the docks as the ship maneuvered itself so that each of the cargo bays would open in their directions. And we all pulled a Master Chief as we opened up the gates and let a very large piece of debris fly. Many times this piece of debris was what was left of those that had tried to take us as prisoner and launched towards each of the guns. Even a near miss was going to be enough to knock the guns offline, as they needed a lot of power and a lot of sensor data to actually fire. And as we got close, we realized this was our one shot. Better make it count. I could say we got about an 80% hit radius, and I got an exact bullseye, and I will keep that forever. At least as a sense of pride, that is. With that, we immediately closed the cargo bay doors, repressurized, and headed straight towards one of the docking areas. This ship may be big, but that whole thing, I'm starting to wonder if it was a planet. Seriously, it makes the Death Star look like a marble. As we got in close to the docking area, the umbilicals were immediately extended out and attached. We could hear alarms going off from even inside the station as we began to pull ourselves close. Right up next to it, it seemed like barely a piece of a pill next to a fist, if you can imagine that. That's what it must have looked like from the outside, as this ship just attached to the side of the station along with others. As soon as the doors opened, we all ran inside. I only had a few bullets, and we had no way of manufacturing any others because there was no sulfur to use. So I couldn't make any gunpowder, but I still carried my pistol with me. With that, we had spiced up a few of their electronic weapons and used those. But most of us, well, we wanted blood. We wanted a lot of blood. And thankfully, a few of the men there knew their blacksmithing very well, and they had made us what we wanted. I carried my twin swords, which is what I have been trained on. Another man got a sword and a shield, with a broadsword, that is. Another one had a whole frickin' claymore. Several others got katanas and everything like that. I even saw it in a ninjaga, which I didn't even know you could make that. But they didn't care. Everyone rushed in, and we could hear through the translator them screeching as they sent their security. They realized we were human. They screamed, "Humans, humans, run, run!" But they couldn't run fast enough. Though we are bipedal, the gravity on that station was nothing compared to what we were used to. It was barely at 0.3 Gs. I'm thinking, crap, we're going to be bouncing up and down like they did on the moon, which was difficult to run on that. We had to actually arch our bodies forward to make sure we didn't push up too much to lift ourselves up off the bulkhead itself. But we didn't care. We knew we had a target, and we knew where to go. Straight to the slave markets. We charged in, slashing at everyone we could, shooting anyone who tried to run away. We dropped every single one of those Xeno bastards, with the exception of one thing. If they had a slave collar on. This slave collar was always attached, and the master held the control. It was used not only to shock them into submission, but turned up all the way was immediately lethal. I remember distinctly finding the first one. It was one of those cat folks, and she was very, very young. So young she hadn't even developed. Hell, I only found out it was a she later. I didn't know if it was male or female, but I grabbed the collar and ripped it off, and she looked up at me, scared. She reached up, grabbed her neck, and realized that the collar was gone, and the tears began to flow down her face. I didn't have time, though, as I wanted another piece of these Xeno bastards. They were enslaving children? Oh, no, you don't. And as we charged forward towards the slaving areas, we realized that we had gone deep into the ship. We had let All the rest began to fan around, and everyone inside was already receiving word that humans were free. Most people didn't run, as they thought this meant only one human was loose. It might take a little while, but eventually humans would run themselves out of energy and they would be incarcerated again. What they were not expecting was us. Fully formed, fully trained, fully armed, and fully pissed off, wanting all sorts of blood. I even saw one of the masters, some bulbous frog-looking freak, hold his slaves up in front of him by the chains, holding 4 different slaves in front of him as though they were a shield. I used the light gravity to my advantage, jumping up, spinning over, hitting the ceiling, dropping down, and shoving one of my swords down across his neck. As I pulled it forward, I realized something. I had pushed hard enough to take his head clean off. The slaves turned around and looked, scared to death at what they just saw, looked over at the body that had just slumped to the ground and started screaming out for their master. I simply looked at them, surprised that they would do this. The only one that was not screaming and crying for their master was a single male, I'm guessing teenage years. Looked kinda canine-ish. I don't know the species, nor did I care. I simply sheathed one of my swords, reached up for the collar, and crushed the front of it with my bare fucking hands. My adrenaline was running so high, I'm pretty sure I could have bent rebar with my bare hands at that point. The young boy reached up to my hand, and he looked scared, believing that it was going to explode. I released the sword in my other hand, reached up and ripped it apart. He looked up, and with the same look of surprise, reached for his neck and realized that the collar was gone. He motioned over to the other ones who were still crying over their supposed master, and one by one I ripped each of their collars off. And with that, a look of sheer shock was in their eyes. They couldn't believe that they were actually free. I could only understand that some of them didn't even understand what that meant. They would never understand what that meant. Not until this very moment. I grinned a little bit, trying desperately not to show my teeth, as I was told that that was a look of aggression. I picked up my other sword, drew my first one, and kept going. It wasn't long till we started to converge on the slaving areas, and sure enough, inside the most reinforced cages I had ever seen were humans, many of them children, all of them wearing collars, all of them chained to the wall with barely any lead, most of them laying in their own filth. As I went through and started looking for the locking mechanism, some sort of release, I finally came across one of the guards. It was holding one of those energy weapons. All right, let's dance. I sheathed my swords, and I bolted at him, moving from side to side randomly, trying to make sure he couldn't get a shot off. He fired once. It barely skimmed my arm. I barely winced from any pain. It only got a couple arm hairs, and then I moved up. It tried to do strange cocking mechanism so that it could recharge again, and by that time that it aimed, I reached up, grabbed its muzzle, spun the muzzle of the weapon around, shoved it underneath its jaw, and fired. The heat radiated up into its brain and cooked it. It smelled kind of like fried chicken. I started searching through the body. I knew there was some sort of controller. He had to have it. Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? Got it. I started going through. Thankfully, with all the research, I knew what to read. I was going through one by one, trying to figure out where is it, master control, and release. With that, you could see all the doors release. I went through again, trying to look for the collar controls. It's not that they're here, they're not here, they're not here. Where the hell are they? I started looking through the body again, but I didn't find one. Thankfully, about 2 seconds later, I heard, "Found it." He started going through a separate controller from another guard that he had taken down, and sure enough, all the collars turned green and popped off. With that, many of the humans reached over and grabbed their spouses, their kin, and their children, trying desperately to hold on to them as they didn't realize what was going on. We looked in and tried to talk to them, but they didn't understand English. They didn't have translators. All they knew was those horrible languages. Those of the slave masters, also known as common. I looked over and I could see a row of children whose collars had popped off, but they weren't moving. I tried to go in and tried to coax them outside the cage, as many of the humans were already trying to get out and trying to clean themselves off with anything. A few of them actually walking over to the former guards and kicking them in kind of an act of defiance. I looked over just a little bit, and the one that had found the collar controls had walked over, waved his finger saying, "No, no, 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 no," like this, and he spit on him. Spit on the dead guard as a true act of "screw you, pal." As I went into the cage, I saw something I really didn't want to see. They were bleeding. Many of them were bleeding through their lower garments. Many of them had some sort of cloth around them, almost like a towel with a rope that was held on, almost like a potato sack, but it was barely anything. Those that weren't covered, it was clear where they were bleeding from. A look into their eyes had shown that their wills had basically been broken. I froze. The rage was taking over. And every single human that saw that, their rage took over. A female that had come with us by the name of Jane saw this and screamed. She couldn't believe what was going on. I stood there still in shock as she pushed me aside and ran to the kids, trying to see if there was anything they could do. She started to take them out one by one. I eventually snapped out of my trance. I helped her get the kids out. We got some sort of something, I don't know what the hell they call it. It's some sort of levitating, I guess you could say, wheelbarrow, and started to take the kids back towards the ship itself. They would need medical attention, and they would need therapy. But I'm no counselor. I'm a soldier. And you have just done one thing that a soldier, aside from if you see a pop shot at Doc, will not stand for. You hurt our kids, you mother... Whoa. I looked at some of the men. They looked at me, and without a single word, we knew what we had to do. It's a good thing we're endurance hunters, because for the next 74 hours we did nothing but go room to room, taking down every one of these bastards. If it wasn't for a slave collar, they were dead. I enjoyed slaughtering every single one of them. Even as they screamed for mercy, I didn't care. I dragged my swords across their throat and watched them drop in their own blood, gasping for the air that they could not get as the blood drained from their bodies and the life left their eyes. Coming across every once in a while another human that was a slave, many of them missing parts, especially the males. They had been sent into arenas to fight, but never given any medical attention. I came across one who was already showing signs of severe gangrene. I didn't even know if the medical tech could handle this. But one of the others came up. As soon as we heard, "Medic!" he came running. But he looked at this man, I don't even know if you could call him a man, barely a teenager. We looked around. There was 4 of us there at the time. And the doc just simply looked him over, looked at us, and shook his head. I got down on one knee next to him, and I held him. Doc held him up too. I drew my pistol. I could feel a hand land on my opposite shoulder. I turned and looked, and there was another soldier just like me, still wearing his fatigues. He looked in my eyes, and he gave me the nod. I did not want to do what I was about to do. But there was nothing our medical tech, not their medical tech, could do. He was dying. And he was suffering. I clicked the hammer back, and the young boy seemed to instinctually know what was going on. He looked up at me, reached over with what was left of his hand, and touched my free arm. He then closed his eyes, and I will never forget the sound, because that was the sound of the last of my soul. I was empty. I have one purpose now, and so the rest of us. We all got up after I holstered my pistol. I looked at the other men next to me, and they had the same look of rage. They had the same look of apathy. They had the same look of, I want to kill these motherfuckers. By the end of our entire wrath, we had reached all the way to the bridge near the center of this space station. They were trying desperately to keep us out, firing randomly into the opening. We had jammed their doors so they couldn't shut. So how do we get in? There must be 50 guys back there, all of them with weapons pointed in. I'm sure they've sent a distress call. We need to get this station under our control and either vent everything or blow it up. What are we going to do? Eventually, one of the guys said, I got an idea. He ran off around the corner and came back just holding just a big piece of metal. Like, okay, what's the idea? He simply stood in front of us. Said, that's easy. Decoy. We all looked at each other and grinned. Oh, this'll be fun. On the count of 3, he dove in, holding that metal in front of him, and we could hear the energy weapons clanking off the piece of metal. We knew that sucker had to be getting hot really quick, but we were right behind him, using the low gravity to jump around, getting around beside them, getting their flanks and over top. A few guys actually clearing over top of the metal shield, and before the adversaries even knew what was going on, we were ripping them to pieces, now with our bare hands, because we had nothing left. Nothing but this moment, nothing but taking down these motherfuckers. These soulless, motherless bastards are going to be done. A few of them tried to run. I even saw one and pounced on him, crushing him into the bulkhead. He squirmed to get away. I reached into his reptilian face and ripped his head off, at least the top of his head. His body spasmed on the ground as I threw the head at another one who was cowering behind a console, striking him in the head with his buddy's head. I kind of laughed and said, well, that's the last time you get head, as I walked over. The lizard was so afraid that he took his own weapon and put it to his head. I guess he didn't want to end up like his friend. The battle was over then. We had the station. We looked into the consoles and we linked in as fast as we could. We got a hold of all the systems, locked down everything. Only about 4 ships had been able to get away, but they had already been on their way when this started. And it would be several days before they got to wherever in the hell they're going and get their asses back. We had about a week. We had about that time to figure out what to do, but it didn't take very long. We rallied up what ships we could. We rallied up what folks we could. We were now the Free Fleet. We grabbed every single one of their vessels. And we knew that there was only one thing we could do with the station. Only one. We set it to self-destruct. And it would blow 5 days after we left. 5 days after we had invaded this system, we left with a 5-day countdown. But we made sure that it wouldn't be easy to find. The fleet left. And with those that we had freed from slavery, we knew it was time for them to get a little piece of their own. We came up with a plan to go to each of their homeworlds and free them. Not only would we free them, we would arm them, we would train them, and we would make sure they are ready to fight back, because this will never happen again. Humanity will become the creatures in the dark, the creatures out in space that they fear. They might have thought we were scary before, because we were strong and fast. But now, you face a combined humanity force of over 20,000, along with over 200,000 free slaves. And we're coming for you.